Mentioned housing. You would like to get the federal government out of housing completely. And right now, the mortgage giants, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, guarantee 90% of the mortgages in this country. So you'd get rid of the government's role.
Sure.
The government's always had a role in housing.
No, they haven't always had a role in housing. They created the monster. I mean, first the Fed creates the money, and then you have Congress get involved and say, you do this, this, and this, and then it becomes corrupt. They get involved in the derivatives business, and who gets bailed out? They got bailed out. So, no, it's a distortion of the market. You don't eliminate...
But play that through, Dr. Paul, because it's really quite jarring. There is no private market right now for mortgages.
Oh, no, that's not true.
Are you going to wind down these companies? Who would buy them? What happens to housing prices, to the housing market?
Well, it would be, the system would be cleansed. It would have been over and done with by now.
You say cleansed, so the market would crash again, and you think that's acceptable?
It should have had a sharp correction because it was artificially manipulated. Once you get this distortion, you have to correct the mistake. So you do what we did in 1921. You allow the correction to occur in 1 year, and you go back to work. If you keep transferring the debt from the private owners or the pseudo-private owners, the Fannie Mae's and the Freddie Mac's that participated in the bankruptcy, you bail them out, and you bail out the banks, and you bail out the Wall Streeters. You dump all this debt on the people.
As we wait for these corrections to play out, though, that can be pretty painful.
Yeah, and they take a long time when the government messes it up. We had this same thing occur after World War I because the Federal Reserve came in 1913, and lo and behold, it was a short time after that they created a lot of new money to fight World War I. Then there had to be the correction, and that happened in 1921. It was real sharp. GDP went down to 15%. But the government kept hands off and was over in 1 year, and we don't even read about that depression. But in 1930, the attitudes changed, that we had gone into accepting this idea of Keynesian economics, that the reason you have recessions, the people aren't spending enough money, and government should, fulfill the role of spending money. So they preached another doctrine. And the Depression lasted till well after World War II, till 1946, until that Depression ended. Japan has accepted that same principle of not having hands off. They're still in the doldrums after 20 years. That they had their big bubble and hasn't corrected. So when you get concerned about the length of the recovery, you have to think, what kind of government policies? Adding more taxes and spending and regulations will just prolong the agony.
What do you think about the availability of credit these days?
Well, it's too available, too easily available, and that's part of the problem, if not the major part of the problem, and it causes a business cycle. In a capitalistic society, one should work for subsistence, and what's left over becomes capital, and that's what they save. They either reinvest it or somebody else reinvests it, and they put it in a savings account. But because of our monetary system, we have created a disincentive to save. There's no incentive to save because the dollar is constantly depreciated, and we're taught to spend the money because consumers drive the economy. And you would say, well, if they don't save, how can you get so much money? How can you go out and buy a house today? And even though mortgage rates have crept up some, still 5% is astoundingly low. Well, it's all artificial. It's not real credit in the sense of it's coming from savings. It's coming from our monetary system, the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve has been given the power and the authority by our Congress, in contrary to the Constitution, to create money out of thin air. That's essentially what they do. They've created a system where we as politicians are rewarded by spending money because that's how we get reelected. We spend the money and we pass out the goods, and people say, oh yeah, he's an effective congressman. And then they give you lower taxes. There's no taxes. We will just print the money. And the Federal Reserve doing this creates it in addition to the fractional reserve banking system. It is magnified. If the Fed creates $1 billion out of thin air and puts it in as a reserve, eventually that turns into $8 billion. And sometimes weeks the Fed can create $5–10 billion in a week, and whatever they want, whatever is necessary to fix interest rates. They're price fixers are what they are. So the Federal Reserve makes credit available, but in a way it's fraudulent and it's theft because it does have value. If you go to the bank and they give you $1 million, we all take it, but it becomes valuable only by diluting the value of somebody else who's holding money. If there are those who are left saving money, they're being robbed robbed because their value of their dollar is going down. At the same time, you get cheap credit because you get the $1 million. And of course, the people who benefit the most in this system are those who get the money first. And those are usually the wealthy people. So the characteristic of a country that depreciates its currency is one that's destined to destroy their middle class. So if you're in the rich class and you're in the banking elite, or you're in the military-industrial complex, or you want to run a deficit because you're going to fund special interest groups, then you like this system. But it's ironic that some who believe that you have to give welfare to everybody to take care of it, rich welfare and poor welfare, are literally really hurting the poor, because it's a tax on the poor. They don't pay income tax, but they pay the inflation tax, and it hurts the poor and low middle income especially, because they end up with an inflation rate. Price inflations go up much faster than those of the rich, and the rich usually don't care. So it is a tax, and the easy credit is very seductive. Politicians love it. The people who get to use it love it. Few people understand it, and I think we're going to have a collapse before they come around to really thinking seriously, about monetary policy and why we have to revamp it. Recently, we have seen the dollar go down sharply. I think it's going to continue, and hopefully it'll wake the people up and find out you have to have honest money and follow the Constitution, because it says only gold and silver can be legal tender. Why is it that the government's allowed to do what we're not allowed to do? See, there's a basic principle in a free society, is that governments can't do what you and I, we can't steal and rob and hurt people. Unfortunately, that's still generally understood, that's a good rule. But we have failed to recognize that the founders understood that governments can't do that either. So if fraud and deceit and paper money is all bad and warmongering is bad, for the people, then governments should be held accountable. So I think they would be outraged. But I bet you they would understand, because they warned us against this. They warned us, and they did not like pure democracy. They wanted a republic, and they would say, well, you're not. Their first words would probably be, well, you become an obsessive democracy where the majority rules. And you're picking socialism, but it's the idea that majority rules and comes in and say, well, we want this and we want that, and as long as the majority opinion thinks they're getting something, and they would probably say, well, you have succumbed to the temptation of getting something for nothing, but you better watch out, because if you get something for nothing, you're going to lose it. The Constitution does not authorize central banking, but the current central bank we have is the Federal Reserve System, and a lot of people refer this as a private bank, and in some ways that isn't fully descriptive of what it is. It's private it's private in the sense that private individuals benefit. The banking elite benefit, and they're the insiders, and they rule. And it's very secretive. I can, as a member of Congress, I can find out more information about what the CIA is doing than what the FOMC is doing, the central bank, what they're doing on monetary policy. That's very, very secretive of what they're doing. But the Congress created it. So it's not like General Motors being a private company. In some ways, it's almost worse than just saying private. The benefits are privatized, and yet it's ultra secretive and all powerful. A person that runs the Federal Reserve, especially when you have somebody like Alan Greenspan, he is probably the most powerful man in the world. As long as the dollar is the reserve currency of the world, Federal Reserve Board chairman can make or break a president. They have more control over the economy. Ultimately, though, and this is where I find a sense of optimism, ultimately, though, the marketplace rules. And that's why I'm optimistic that this will all be sorted out. Take, for instance, in the 60s, we all knew that $35 an ounce wouldn't hold for gold, because we knew they printed too much money. But the authorities, the central bank and the Treasury and everybody got behind supporting gold, the dollar at $35.
You're talking about the London gold pool now?
The gold pool and the pseudo-gold standard of Bretton Woods.
Yeah.
And this is when I became a true believer, because I read Austrian economics and I said, it won't work, it won't work. And boy, August 15th, 1971, Bretton Woods collapsed. And of course, gold took off. So the market ultimately rules, even though under today's circumstances, a Bernanke or a Greenspan, very, very powerful. And they might, I'm sure they are trying to manipulate the price of gold, and they're always trying to manipulate the value of dollars, and the people are deceived, and the world plays this game that the dollar is as good as gold and it's a reserve currency. So we have this wonderful benefit in this country of printing gold. It used to be you had to earn the gold, and then if you spent it, you had real money. But now the world has been deceived. Instead of it totally collapsing in 1971, we inherited a system that allowed America to be the producers of gold, which is paper, and we have great commodity or consumer goods, but we lost all our industry because it was much easier to ship these jobs out and let somebody else do the hard work, because we have the unlimited supply of gold, which is our dollar. Mm-hmm. And so it's been a fantastic thing. But I'm convinced that the system we have today will no longer last than did.
We're abusing it too much.
And people will come around to rejecting the dollar, because we depend on countries like Japan and China to finance our current account deficits. So we get the money comes flowing back, and they loan it to us at cheap rates, and we finance our war and our welfare. I mean, if this system could continue to work indefinitely, it would mean that Americans would not have to work ever again. We would just loaf the rest of our lives and just print the money and buy whatever we needed. And one day, a long time before we all quit working, the world will wake up and find out that we in this country who have lived beyond our means unfairly will be living beneath our means. And even though the very wealthy who have benefited tremendously from this system, many of them will know the tricks of the trade, and they know what to come in, and they'll protect themselves. But there'll be many of those who don't quite understand this and think that this wealth is perpetual, and they'll be brought down as well. I'm in the business of protecting liberty as a congressman. So that's my goal. And I think of what's happened in third world countries, or in particular in Germany. Ultimately, when you have chaos, economic chaos brought about by monetary manipulation, runaway inflation, the threat is not to the loss of their personal wealth, which is a possibility. The real tragedy is the coming of a dictator. You know, whom are we going to blame? The Nazis blamed the Jews, and it has to be always a scapegoat. And then they go in and accept the dictator, and it takes a long time to iron that out, and too often that leads to war. And just back to the basics, the education, the understanding, the founders' message, the message we have in our Constitution, it could all be preventable, but we yield to the temptation of a free lunch.
One thing I might say that we have made some inroads on the Federal Reserve. We passed a bill last year. We got a partial, audit of the Fed, and we've learned a whole lot. They were dealing in $15 trillion. $5 trillion went overseas to bail out foreign banks. But you know what? Congress did a lot. I've worked on it for a good many years, but Bloomberg helped and Fox helped. They had court cases, Freedom of Information Act, and there are some even at this table who didn't think auditing the Fed was such a good idea, that we could call up the Fed and ask them, and they would tell us what they're doing. I've been calling them up for 30 years, and they never tell me. But we're getting to the bottom of it. But if you want to understand why we have a problem, you have to understand the Fed, because the cause comes from the business cycle. We shouldn't be asking what to do exactly with the recession. Obviously, we have to deal with that, but you can't cure the disease if you don't know the cause of it. And the cause is the booms. When there are booms, and they're artificial, whether it's the CRA or whether it's the Fed easy credit, when you have bubbles, whether it's the NASDAQ or whether it's the housing bubbles, they burst. And when they do, you have to have corrections, and that's what we're dealing with. And we can do this by building coalitions and not sacrificing any principles.